Hello, everyone. It's Dr. Marks, and our topic for today is, does trade create or destroy jobs? And of course, that's the million-dollar question. I want to think about how we often characterize trade, because the media is often quick to depict trade as being bad for jobs. Again, it depends on the slant of the media, but we often get this kind of one-sided story that trade is bad for jobs. We're going to result in job loss. We should eliminate trade, or in some sectors of our economy, to protect domestic jobs. So let's think about a scenario where the USA imports televisions from China. Then, of course, that would mean there's fewer televisions that are produced here. And so that's the depiction. We're importing from China, which means we're going to produce fewer televisions here. Of course, then we translate that into job loss. So jobs at the television factory are going to decrease. And of course, workers may be displaced. So that's often the way the media spins trade. Again, we're importing, which means we produce less domestically. Jobs are lost here, workers are displaced. And while there might be some truth to this, what I want to do in this presentation is help you understand maybe a little bit better framework for thinking about the trade-off that we're going to see. The truth, unfortunately, is often distorted. So as a good economist or a student of economics, you've got to be able to think through what you're hearing in the media and the rhetoric. You need to know how to ask the right questions. Let's start with a simple model. And let's suppose that the United States makes televisions for $400. So they make them and sell them for $400. And let's further assume that the United States is the only producer of televisions. So we sell televisions for $400 and we're the only producers of televisions. So we face no competition at all in the market for televisions. Well, on the surface, it seems like this would be good, right? Doesn't everyone want to be a monopolist? And of course, from the television producer's perspective, they love this, right? They're a monopolist, they have no competition, and for them, it might be good. But that's not the question economists want to ask. We want to ask, is this a good situation? Not just for producers, but in general, for the economy, for consumers. Of course, we would want to acknowledge that the American television producers are going to sell many televisions. Without a doubt, when you're a monopolist, you're going to sell a lot and make a lot of money, for sure. So let's look at this in terms of pictures, our very simple model. So who produces televisions in the United States? Well, I had to Google that because I wasn't really sure, but RCA is one company and Magnavox is another. And I know you have heard of those brands. So we've got RCA and Magnavox, and they produce televisions and sell them for $400. And so they're going to sell a lot of televisions, right? Well, there they are, lots of televisions. And they're going to price them at $400 and they're going to sell them to the public. All right, that's one way of thinking about it. Well, that's what life looks like without trade. But now let's say China decides to make televisions too. Before it was just American producers, but now China wants to get into the game and they want to make televisions. And let's assume that they can produce them and sell them for $300. So their price is clearly lower than the domestic price here in the United States. So China gets in the game, they can produce and sell televisions for $300. We want to think through the economic effect of this, and there's more than one thing we have to think about. So what would be the economic effect of this competition from China? Is it a totally bad thing? Should we simply say, hey, this is completely bad for everyone involved, and we should use trade barriers to prevent competition? Well, should we use trade barriers to prevent competition from China in televisions? Let's investigate this a little bit further. So again, let's look at this with pictures. I had to Google a producer of televisions in China, and I found a company, Konka. I don't even know if I'm saying it right, but they're a Chinese producer of televisions. So here's their televisions, and as we said, they're going to price them at $300, and they're going to sell them to consumers. And we want to think through the economic effects of this. Well, one important thing that we have to acknowledge is that consumers are now better off. That's something that the media doesn't always say, right? Trade is bad. Well, when we import things from other countries and they're cheaper than our products, consumers win. So consumers are going to be better off when they can get that $300 television instead of the $400 television. They're getting televisions for cheaper, but we also want to remember that they now have $100 in their pockets. That was $100 they would have spent on domestic televisions that now they get to keep in their pocket. Now, it's important that we acknowledge that American firms are going to sell fewer televisions. Again, that's totally true, and I acknowledge that. But is that the only story? And unfortunately, that's the story we tend to hear a lot. Oh, when China starts producing televisions, and if we let them flow into the United States, then American firms are going to sell fewer televisions. Well, if that's true, and when that's true, and it likely is, certainly they're going to need less workers to produce televisions. Let's just throw that out there. I agree with that. But part of the story is missing. And that's what I want to help you understand, that we can't just simply say American firms sell fewer televisions and therefore they are going to need less workers and workers are going to be displaced. I acknowledge that's true, but we as economists need to focus on the full story. Let's focus on this idea that consumers now are saving $100 on each television, so they're better off. That's a key part of the story. Consumers are better off when we import things because prices are lower. But we also need to ask another important question, and that important question is, where does this $100 in savings go? Right? It doesn't just poof, disappear, right? Where does the $100 that everyone's now saving go? Well, what if they use that $100 to eat out more? Or what if they buy American products with it? So back to our situation, we've got Chinese televisions being bought by American consumers for $300. But the other part of the story we have to illustrate is that now those consumers have $100 more in their pocket, and that's going to create economic activity as well. Maybe they increase the size of their DVD collection, or maybe they eat a lot more hamburgers. Those are both things that create economic activity. And that part of the story is always missing when we hear the rhetoric about trade. So we need to think about what I'm going to call this spillover effect. And that spillover effect is coming from the fact that people have more money in their pockets, that $100. And remember that extra money in their pockets, that $100, was a result of imports, right? That was a result of importing the cheaper Chinese televisions, which kept $100 in the consumer's pocket. This $100 in everyone's pocket can translate into economic activity as well. So we have to remember that. If we import things for which we do not have a comparative advantage, and we expand where we do have a comparative advantage, so again, We're going to import those things for which we do not have a comparative advantage, and we're going to expand where we do have a comparative advantage. Well, when we do that, we can create better, higher paying jobs. That's the end result when we focus on what we do best and we trade for the rest. So I'll say that one more time because I don't have it on the slide. We should focus on what we do best and trade for the rest. And when we do that, it creates better and higher paying jobs. So by importing something like clothing, which we do not have a comparative advantage in, we have a very small clothing industry in the United States, and it's relatively unsuccessful. We're clearly outcompeted by countries and places like Southeast Asia. But by importing clothing, what we do is free up resources that can flow into other areas like technology and pharmaceuticals. Those are things for which we do have a comparative advantage, especially pharmaceuticals. All over the world, they use American medicines. All over the world, they're watching American movies. So entertainment is another area that we have a comparative advantage. All over the world, they are driving American cars. So this can make us better off. Specialize in what you do best and trade for the rest. So here you have the same diagram. We've got the Chinese company, Konka, or however you pronounce it, producing TVs, selling them to American consumers for $300, which results in a savings for the American consumer of $100. And now they buy more iTunes gift cards, which means there's more demand for jobs in terms of technology, because that's all online stuff. And maybe they buy more medicines. I'm just using those two as examples. Maybe they're kind of silly examples, but you get the idea. Another thing we need to acknowledge is that now American firms have a push to innovate. If you're Magnavox, if you're RCA, you need to be thinking about what's next. How do you build the better mousetrap? How do you compete? So you've got to find ways to compete. And sometimes that's refining the product you're already producing. Sometimes that's the idea of creating new products. You've got to be thinking about what's next. So this is an important source of innovation. You're going to expand into other areas that maybe you're not in right now. So Magnavox, when they create a new product or they innovate, is going to expand into other venues. However, it is important to acknowledge this is not seamless, and I'm not trying to suggest it is. It doesn't happen instantaneously. What I mean is that workers can transition as other industries expand. So as we buy more things using the internet and we need more programmers to keep those internet programs up and running, workers can transition as other industries expand. The United States economy has lots of examples of how competition fosters this kind of innovation. So let me give you a few examples that I got from the Heritage Foundation. In the 1980s, personal computers were very, very expensive. Very few people owned personal computers back in the 1980s, and they couldn't really do very much. Now, to the right, you see a picture of the IBM PC Junior. This was one of the first commercially viable personal computers for people like you and me. Now, I went to college in 1984. I went to Emory University, didn't like it, left after a semester, but I went with an IBM PC Junior. I was the only person on campus who had one. It costs about $1,000 at the time. It had 100 meg of RAM. You can imagine that's teeny tiny, right? Think about your jump drive. Your jump drive might be 32 gigabytes. You can now carry 32 gigabytes of memory, even more maybe, on a teeny tiny flash drive. But my computer had 100 meg of RAM. And so when I wanted to use a computer, I had to use floppy disks. You're probably saying, what is that? What are you talking about? Well, those 5 1/4 quarter, 5.5-inch floppy disks, and I had to switch back and forth between the program and something to save it on. So again, it was pretty sophisticated for the time, but it's nothing like what we have now. By 2002, 65.9% of people living in the United States owned a personal computer, guys, and that was a number of years ago. So almost 70% of people owned a personal computer by 2002. Of course, they were far more sophisticated than their predecessors. And today, gosh, just about everybody has one, right? So all of this innovation came from competition. And trade is a form of competition, and we need to acknowledge that. Another example, the airline industry. In 1975, the airline industry carried about 200 million passengers. So that's for the year 1975, 200 million passengers in a year. Now it carries almost 600 million passengers a year. We've seen huge growth in the airline industry. And again, this is due to competition. We've found ways to do it better, faster, cheaper. And think about it, folks, we have global competition. If you want to fly across country, you can fly with American Airlines, you can fly with all kinds of airlines from other countries. I'm going to be taking groups to Thailand shortly. We're going to be on Emirates Air. We could have flown Turkish Air. We could have flown American Airlines. Lots of competition, and it's been good for you and me as consumers of airline travel. In 1987, not even 1% of Americans owned mobile phones. Now, I realize you weren't alive in 1987 unless you're a non-traditional student, but in 1987, I had just finished my master's degree, and I certainly did not have a mobile phone. By 2002, 50% of the American public owned a mobile phone. And of course, now everyone has one, right? So the percentage of people who had phones went up. Same thing with televisions. If we look at televisions, it went from about 49% in 1975 to almost 94% in 2001. Again, this is from competition. So competition has led to innovation. It's led to new products. It's improved quality. It's decreased prices. But we want to know, is this good or bad in terms of employment? And again, competition could be just domestic, but remember, trade is a form of competition. So when we have competition through trade, is it good or bad in terms of employment? Well, turns out there's no simple answer to this question. There's no simple answer to whether or not trade is good or bad for jobs. What we know is that trade can certainly destroy jobs. We acknowledge that as economists. For example, the television jobs that might be impacted in our very simple scenario when we started competing with China. Well, if you were a producer of televisions, if you went to work every day and worked on a television assembly line, well, your job might be impacted for sure. When we compete and we produce less televisions, your job is at risk. But trade can also create jobs. What we're concerned with is the net effect. So trade can destroy jobs, trade can create jobs, but what we want to know is what happens in terms of the net effect. Well, the net effect is very simple. We want to know net jobs, and that's simply going to be the number of jobs created minus the number of jobs lost. We have to understand that this is indeed a trade-off. There will be winners and there will be losers. There will be jobs created and there will be jobs lost. where the extra money goes, right, as we save on imports, that certainly matters. So in our scenario with the televisions, that $100 that went into consumers' pockets, where does that go? That's going to have a lot to do with jobs created and jobs lost. How do firms respond? That will also have an effect on jobs created and jobs lost. So again, it's going to determine what industries might expand and, of course, what industries might contract. This is a nice graphic from a study that was published in 2015. They're not very clear on what year this data is, but we're seeing a number of developing countries here. And notice that we've got three colors. In dark blue, we've got net job creation. In white, we've got gross job creation. And in the lighter blue, gross job destruction. Okay, let's make sure we understand what that's talking about. So, white is simply number of jobs created. Lighter blue, number of jobs lost. If we take the white minus the lighter blue, we get the dark blue, net job creation. So let's focus on the dark blue. And what we see is that in transitioning periods, we've seen Latvia and Mexico and Argentina and Estonia and Hungary and some other industrial economies that have been averaged together, they have seen net job creation over time. Slovenia and Romania, a little bit different story. So a number of these countries have seen net increases in jobs. But the economists would point out that this is in the long run. Now, what we mean by long run is unclear. The long run is not a week, it's not a month, it may not even be a year. However, there might be some pain in the short run. So we have to acknowledge that in the short run, there may be costs as countries change their trade policies. But in the long run, hopefully we see what some of these other countries have seen, net job creation. So what I'm trying to point out is that the transition is not seamless. There are costs in the short run, benefits in the long run, but we can see net job creation. To do this, however, we have to have labor transition, and that might require training, education, right? Your workforce needs to flow from industries that are shrinking to industries that are expanding. There's a trade-off. There are winners and there are losers. It is indeed a trade-off. We have to acknowledge that this whole thing is a competition-driven process, and trade creates competition. So when we talk about trade, we're really just talking about something that fosters competition, but it's fostering global competition. Trade can propel workers from low productivity and low quality jobs, and it can move them to higher productivity, higher quality, and hopefully higher wage jobs. So competition and trade can do this. It can propel workers from low productivity, low quality jobs to higher productivity, higher quality, hopefully higher paying jobs. But in the short term, there are some costs. We want to acknowledge that there is a short run, long run trade-off here. And these impacts in the short run can differ from industry to industry. Right? No two industries are going to be impacted exactly the same. But of course, if you're a worker in the TV factory we've been talking about, this is not a lot of consolation, right? For that worker who loses their job because we're importing too many TVs, well, they don't care that there's a long run benefit, right? It's going to be pretty hard to convince that worker that the costs in the short run are worth the benefits in the long run. And I totally understand that philosophy, right? If you're the one whose job is displaced, it is really hard to get behind this idea of trade. The bad news is that it might be hard as economists for us to predict how industries are impacted when we change our trade policies. We don't really know how they're going to be impacted. There's just not a lot of research on what happens when countries change their trade policies. One big reason for this is that there's not a lot of data available to economists. There's not a lot of data that we can work with. It's also difficult for us as economists to hold all else constant. And those of you who have had other economics classes, you know what I'm talking about, hold all else constant. Well, what I mean by that is that usually trade's not the only thing changing. When a country decides to change its trade policy, it might be accompanied by other things that are also changing. That makes it hard for us as economists to isolate the effect of freer trade because other variables are also changing. For example, what if a country is freeing up trade, but at the same time, economic freedom is increasing? And what if at the same time, corruption is falling? Well, let's say that we see economic growth. How much of it came from freer trade? How much came from the fact that people have more economic freedom? And how much of that growth came from the fact that we're seeing a decrease in corruption? Again, you really want to run an experiment in a controlled environment. That's very difficult to do in the real world. Are all people going to benefit equally? Well, the answer is no. We know there are going to be some people who won't benefit at all from trade. There will be losers in the trade game. Remember, jobs are lost. Certain industries will shrink, and there will be people who are displaced. Workers have to transition. They're going to have to transition from shrinking industries to expanding industries. And that may be easier in some industries than in other industries. And it might be easier for some workers than other workers, right? So not everyone's going to face the exact same situation. It's going to differ from industry to industry, and it's probably going to differ from worker to worker. Likely, workers with very, very specialized skills, ones that are very specific to only key industries, they might have a harder time transitioning, right? What if your skill is very, very specialized in terms of garment manufacturing? I'm not talking about some high-tech thing. I should really probably say you've got a specialized labor-intensive skill. Well, let's say that I've become an expert on this one particular process of garment making. Well, that's a very specialized skill, and that skill may not transition that easily to other industries. If you're a worker whose skills are being replaced by technology, well, you might be hurt, right? If you are now being replaced by robotics as we move in that direction, well, it might be a little bit hard for you to transition as well. In addition, the gains from trade may not be equally shared when we look at industrialized versus developing nations. So the gains from trade may differ for industrialized versus developing nations. Developing nations tend to focus on labor-intensive items, right? Think about it. Clothing, agriculture. So developing nations tend to focus on things that are very labor-intensive. Clothing, agriculture. They're going to be big exporters of these kinds of things. Well, developed nations can specialize in more sophisticated products. And that doesn't necessarily mean that developing nations can't trade. They certainly can. But it's going to be important that you think about the kinds of goods that developed nations are going to transition into cars, medicine, and entertainment, versus developing nations. So they're producing different kinds of products. So what if the playing field's not level here? As we talk about trying to move towards kind of global trade, what if the playing field isn't level? For example, what if country X heavily subsidizes production of wheat? And if you're not familiar with what I mean by subsidize, maybe they pump in money into the wheat industry. Maybe government cost shares with farmers for various things. So country X is heavily subsidized in the production of wheat. Well, what if you're in country Y and you're also a wheat producer? Do you agree that country Y will have a much harder time competing if country X is heavily subsidizing production of wheat? That's what I mean by not really having a level playing field. How does country Y compete if country X is being subsidized? That's not really fair competition. Or what if country Z has trade barriers in place because they want to keep out their competition? Well, if country Z is putting trade barriers in place, well, then that means other countries aren't going to have access to their markets. So again, the playing field's not really that level. So global trade needs to be accompanied by rules that try to level the playing field, right? If we really want to have everyone getting a piece of the pie, then global trade needs to make the playing field more level, and there are kind of rules that can help. For example, maybe those rules involve reductions of tariffs and quotas, something that, depending on what class you're in, you may have already heard a lot about. Of course, the idea here is that we want as much competition as possible, fair competition. That's the goal of things like GATT. If you're not familiar with GATT, that's the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, and it's been around for decades. We're not going to go into it much, but there are also agreements made through the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And depending on what class you're in as you view this presentation, you may have learned a little bit about that. But there are some global agreements with the goal of trying to level the playing field. So in summary, there's no universal answer to the question of whether trade destroys jobs or creates jobs. The answer is that it does both. It destroys jobs and creates jobs. But there's evidence that suggests that the net effect in the long run, emphasis on in the long run, is that it creates jobs. So there's evidence that suggests that the net effect is that jobs are created in the long run. Some are lost, some are created, but there's more creation than jobs lost. The net effect can be positive. But it's easy for us to focus on the costs in the short run, and there will be costs. There's labor that might be displaced, and of course, unemployment can increase. Labor has to transition and has to be absorbed into the expanding industries. And as we've talked about, that's not something that's seamless, right? This is more of a long-run phenomena. So understand that the transition can be costly in the short run, but what we've learned as economists is that the gains are there in the long run. In the long run, trade makes the global economic pie increase. So you may understand what I mean by economic pie, but if we think about kind of the, all economic activity, if we think about it as a big giant pie, that pie gets bigger when we have trade. But there's no guarantee that the benefits of trade are divided equally, right? There's no guarantee that the benefits of trade are divided equally. In other words, the pie might be getting bigger, but there's no guarantee that everyone gets a slice that's bigger than before. Of course, trade works best when it's free trade. And by free trade, we're talking about situations where there's not tariffs and there's not quotas restricting the flow of goods. So free trade is best when there's not tariffs and there's not quotas in place restricting the flow of goods. And of course, when the playing field is as level as possible. Proving the case for trade, as we've said, is very difficult. There's very limited field work. There's no real data sets for us as economists to work with. And any real-world experiments where we see countries changing their trade regimes, well, they're going to have confounding factors. So it's hard to have a clean experiment where we can isolate only the effect of a change in trade policy. And for this reason, free trade can be hard to sell, especially when the media portrays only part of the story. Nevertheless, economists almost universally support the idea of free trade. And so likely, depending on what class you're in, you're going to be learning a lot more, or you have already learned a lot more about free trade. Thank you for listening, and have a fantastic day.